I want to welcome you all to this webinar featuring Martin Wolf, almost certainly the most influential financial or economics journalist in the world. We are very, very grateful and appreciative that Martin agreed to come on this webinar at a very early time in London for him. So before we start the formal proceedings of the webinar, it is traditional to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which our 4 Australian campuses stand and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, this is one of the latest, the most recent of a series of webinars that we have at the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability at the Monash Business School have been running since the beginning of the pandemic last year. As we have been very fortunate to have a series of truly distinguished speakers and panelists come online for us and reaching a quite wide audience both within Australia and particularly in the Asian region, but also beyond. Now, so today's webinar, as you know, Martin Wolf would be speaking on the uneven economic recovery in the world. And we have also 2 very distinguished panelists, Professor Andrew Lee and Dr. Sarah Hunter. Professor Simon Wilkie, the Dean of the Monash Business School, of which the Center CDS, our center is a unit, will be the moderator in the webinar. Professor Wilkie himself has a very distinguished and very varied background. He has been both an academic professor in economics in the US and also worked in the government as well as in the corporate sector as chief economist at Microsoft. Now, without further ado, I will invite Professor Wilkie to come online and begin his task of moderating the webinar, introducing the speakers and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, Cicero. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the latest in our outstanding series of webinars that CDS has put on. And I'd like to extend my thanks and congratulations to the team for yet another phenomenal panel. But I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am standing today, which is the members of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their leaders past, present, and emerging. As I mentioned, we have a stellar panel. The format of today is that we will have a presentation by Professor Martin Wolf and then a panel discussion. The presentation should go for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to the panel for discussions, and then Q&A. Q&A, we could use if you could please put your question into the Q&A part of the Zoom panel, and then we will curate the questions and try and answer as many as we can. But let me just introduce the panel. As we mentioned, our keynote speaker is Professor Martin Wolf, widely regarded as the world's most influential economic journalist. He's associate editor and chief economics commentator at the Financial Times, London. He's a fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford College, Corpus Christi, King's College, and an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham. a University Global Fellow of Columbia, and a Senior Fellow at the Global Economic Policy at CEPA at Columbia, where many of my old friends are, a member of the International Media Council of the World Economic Forum, has served as a member of the UK government's Independent Commission on Banking, and has been awarded Commander of the British Empire in 2000 for his services to financial journalism. Our panelists include the Honorary Dr. Andrew Leigh, MP. Andrew is the Shadow Assistant Minister for Treasury and Charities and is the federal member for FENA in the ACT. Previously, he was a professor of economics at the Australian National University before he decided to go over to the dark side. He's been widely published in the top economic journals and holds a PhD in public policy from Harvard University, having graduated from the University of Sydney with first-class honours in law and arts, but we won't hold that against him. Dr. Leigh is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. And rounding up the panel, we're very happy to have Dr. Sarah Hunter joining us. Sarah Hunter's chief economist at BIS Oxford Economics. She's a macroeconomic analyst, and her analysis is regularly featured on the ABC, the Australian Fin Review, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and the Sydney Morning Herald. Dr. Hunter has a PhD in economics from the University of Oxford, a master's from the LSE, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Cambridge. So with that rather long introduction to our esteemed panel, I'm going to invite Martin Wolf to the stage, our virtual stage, and put the spotlight on him in the presentation. Thank you for joining us.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm sure I'm going to enjoy it and learn a lot. I should insist that really and truly, I'm not a professor, strictly honorary. And since I decided very early in my professional career not to be an academic, it would seem very unfair to steal this distinguished title from people who actually earn it, like, for example, my very distinguished wife. So I'm just Mr. Wolf. I didn't do a PhD for a whole set of reasons, which we can discuss. And I have a number of honorary doctorates, which are equally meaningless from this point of view. So it's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm going to give an overview of these issues. It's a very complicated topic, so you'll understand this is all very bird's eye view, and I can only illuminate with charts just a small proportion of the propositions I'm going to make. But let me just now try to start the presentation, which is, of course, the key thing. And I hope it will now work. I believe it should now be on. Please tell me if it isn't. So the title we agreed on is Why COVID is Creating an Unequal Global Recovery. Unequal, as I will indicate, on many different dimensions. As I think is so often the case for us, while people were, of course, aware of the possibility of pandemics, indeed it had been very widely discussed among medical professionals and indeed economists, it's only when it actually happens that you really realize, feel what it means. And we've learned a great deal in the last, well, nearly 2 years now, not quite, about what a pandemic of this kind means. And one of the things it clearly has meant is creation of extraordinarily divergent impacts on multiple dimensions. And that's a big part explaining why getting out of this, as it were, together within our societies and across countries globally is and will remain, in my view, so difficult. So I'm going to start, however, with a quote which is, I think, helpful in illuminating one aspect of the consequence of COVID, which reinforces, I'll come to this in a moment, the impact of the financial crisis, which began about 14 years ago or so. We lived for a long time globally in the shadow, if that's the right word, under the influence of this idea, most famously put by Ronald Reagan in the early 80s. I think it was 81, but I might have got the year wrong. And he used the sentence anyway very often, so we don't need to date it precisely. But he said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And that attitude, what you might call the Reagan-Thatcher view of the world, which in a quite different way, obviously completely different way, under Deng Xiaoping, influenced the reform and opening up movement of China. The idea that basically what we're trying to do is liberate the market from the dead hand of government has taken obviously a formidable battering, I would have thought mortal blows, with the financial crisis and now COVID, because what these things have done, and I think in a way maybe the most important things they've done, is they brought government back into the center of our lives in the most intrusive way. And as I understand it, Melbourne is in lockdown. There can't be anything much more intrusive than the government telling you in peacetime that you can't leave your home. I mean, that is the government back in an absolutely enormous way. And this is happening in a country which is led by a center-right government, which most of us thought was really quite libertarian. It turns out, obviously, that that was quite wrong. Anyway, that's where I start. What I'm going to do in my remarks, and I'll try and finish them in about half an hour from now, is set the scene for our thinking about what's happened since COVID-19, which I'm just going to call COVID, burst upon our consciousness in early 2021. First of all, I'll just say something very briefly about what the world economy looked like before COVID, because I think COVID hit us a world economy which was already had certain characteristics, which I can't explore in detail, of course, written a whole book about the crisis, but that's where I'll start. Then I'll talk about its impact, some of the big global impacts, the things, as it were, that were obvious about what happened and which were sort of fairly widely shared. And then I will talk about how COVID divided the world. I would look more closely at this notion of the divisions in the world, within countries and across countries, in our very variegated and unequal world, how this worked. And then I'll talk about what that might mean for the future, both in terms of what I think will happen and a little bit about what I think should happen. So that's just to tell you what I'm going to do. Now, let me talk about the world economy before COVID. The first point, just bear in mind, this is the second huge and essentially unexpected global shock in 15 years. By unexpected, I really don't wish to suggest that nobody thought we could have financial crises and nobody thought we couldn't have pandemics. Obviously, many people did, but really, essentially, nobody expected either to happen when they did. They weren't geared up for it, as it were. It felt, in both cases, like a bolt from the blue to most people. And in that sense, it's a shock. I've used this phrase before. It's a shock, but not a surprise, if you like. And it's the second huge one. And both of them have upset our normal way of doing things, our sense of stability of the world, I think, quite profoundly. I don't have time to show you the chart on this, but it's very important, at least in the high income countries, which I'm going to talk about a fair amount, that they never really fully recovered from the financial crisis. I have a chart which is in a book I'm publishing at the moment, finishing at the moment, which shows GDP per head relative to what it would have been if the pre-financial crisis trends had continued. And we find that of the G7 countries, the only one whose GDP per head has basically remained on trend since the crisis is Germany, and all the others have had huge losses. And in the case of the UK, Italy, GDP per head is about 25% below pre-crisis trends. So these are absolutely enormous shocks in both cases. And by the way, the US is about 20% below trend. Another important thing that happened after the crisis, particularly relevant, I think, for you, is that globalization slowed. It slowed for many reasons. Essentially, the relationship between trade growth and world GDP growth was transformed. World GDP growth slowed a bit, though not as much as one would expect from what happened to high-income countries, because developing countries continue to grow quite fast, but China's growth slowed too. I'm going to come to that in a moment. But trade growth fell much more. So particularly commodities trade growth really slowed very sharply. And partly that's because of protectionism, and partly because of the exhaustion of opportunities to integrate supply chains across borders. So we've moved into a slowdown of globalization. And as I've already mentioned, after the immense surge in investment and growth in 2009 and 2010, China's also experienced a substantial growth slowdown since the financial crisis, though I don't think it was directly because of it. And significantly, that relied on huge increases in debt. And that fits into a broader theme I will touch upon at the end, which is the indebted state of the world economy, which is basically true of all major economies for both the public and private sectors. So that's basically where we start, the sort of backdrop to this crisis. In early 2020, above all in the second quarter, high-income countries had probably the sharpest recessions ever. I say probably simply because we don't obviously have precise quarterly measurements of GDP before GDP accounting really got going in the 40s. So this is sort of a guesstimate, but I'll show you a chart which compares what happened in the second quarter last year with the Great Recession, and the contrast is very striking. We had a massive plunge, and more broadly, I think it's fair to say the pandemic caused significantly greater economic, social, and political disruption than expected. Again, I won't be able to show you the chart, but I actually went back in one column I wrote to look at very detailed economic analyses that had been done by the Congressional Budget Office and EU Commission's Economics Office, both by professional economists. And they looked at the question, how big would the GDP and other economic impacts of something like the Spanish flu, which I'm going to come to in a moment, how big would that impact be now? And what was interesting, and I'll come to that, though the COVID-19 is clearly, so far at least, a far less significant pandemic than the Spanish flu was in terms of its virulence, fatalities, and who was affected by it. The economic impact of COVID-19 initially was far bigger than any of these people expected. Its immediate impact was much bigger than anybody expected. And as I said, this was so, even though viewed as a pandemic, it's been relatively mild, at least so far. And I use mild in quotation marks. I don't want to in any way underplay the significance of what happened to people in this. But a recent, and I think very interesting analysis by The Economist looked at what not at reported deaths, from COVID, which we know are wildly inaccurate because testing is so inadequate and has been so inadequate in so many parts of the world. It looked at excess deaths, and it estimated that COVID has killed about 15 million people, which is about 0.2% of today's global population. Spanish flu, there are wide estimates, but it is estimated by the CDC in the US to have killed around 50 million people in 2 years. I think it was between 2019 and 21, and 1919 and 21. And that was 3% of the world population at that time. So this was more than an order of magnitude more severe in terms of death. And not only was it more fatal in this way, it really decisively was deadly for young people and children. And there's COVID-19 by and large has not been, and just think what it would have done if it had been killing our children and our young people in that way. So given that, the impact on our society has been quite remarkable. So, and I'll come in a moment to why that's so. So this just is a chart for a number of larger economies. I'm sorry Australia wasn't on it. We prepared this a little while ago, and it just looked at the light blue bar is what happened to the GDP of countries in the Great Recession between 2000 and fourth quarter of 2007 to the second quarter of 2009, which were peak to trough. And the dark blue bar is the fourth quarter 2019 to the end of the second quarter 2020, which is the really big impact. And you can see, I mean, economies essentially closed down. These are staggeringly quick closures, and they closed down because that's exactly what happened. They closed down. So we had a quite remarkable, as far as I can see, unprecedented event in terms of the deliberate decision to close our economies down. So let's think about, why did COVID cause such immediate economic mayhem? It was in sizable part because for the first time in world history, prosperous countries could actually afford to close large parts of their economies. People, and they could have, one of the reasons they could afford it is that large parts of their economies could be shielded by the sort of technology we're using now. And the other part of it was they felt they had the fiscal and monetary freedom of maneuver to do so. And so far, that has proved to be the case. High-income countries showed themselves, in general, absolutely determined to protect their health systems. And in some cases, though this was not unique to high-income countries, to protect the health of their population to the highest possible degree. I'll come to that in a moment. All countries were willing, pretty well, as far as I can see, all countries were willing to close their borders to travel, and able to do so relatively easily. Again, that didn't really happen with Spanish flu. And above all, there was an overwhelming priority in many countries, developed and developing, in fact, to protect life. This wasn't true everywhere. I'll come to that in a moment. It's part of the divergent story I'm going to tell you. But for these reasons, let me just, for these reasons, and I'm giving a very much an overview, we essentially allowed our economies to stop. And that was particularly true in the high-income countries, where it was easier to cushion much of the population in a way that obviously, and I'll come to this again in the divergent section, most developing and emerging countries couldn't do, either because they didn't have the resources or such an enormous proportion of their population work in the informal sector, which depend on face-to-face interactions. And once you close them down, people would starve. There are other big impacts of COVID-19 on the world. Perhaps the most striking is what shown by what we're doing now, which is not something we'd have done 3 years ago. we had technology, it turned out, weren't most of us aware of it, that allowed us to operate businesses and all sorts of other interactions online. And we basically moved to use them in a few weeks. It must be one of the most, if not the most striking example of global acceleration of the adoption of technology ever. I can remember this very well in my own personal work life. The FT never is a global operation, small one, but a global operation. We, of course, have a series of offices around the world where people work, though we communicated freely with one another across these offices, mostly by phone. And suddenly we discovered, really in a few days, that we could produce our daily product exactly as if we were all in the office, though nobody was, literally nobody. So, well, slight exaggeration. And that's, of course, replicated by businesses and other organizations across the world, essentially overnight. And that something 10 years ago, perhaps even 5 years ago, we couldn't have done. So that's an incredibly important impact. I suspect we have jumped ahead in terms of our adoption of these technologies by 5 to 10 years. We, of course, have demonstrated, and again, not really expected, acceleration of vaccine development. We've been able to produce a very large number of pretty effective vaccines unbelievably quickly and vaccinate very large parts of the world's population. I'm going to come to this in a moment. So that's the second thing we've learned. And both of them are, of course, are about technological prowess, things we can do and demonstrably can do under pressure, which allow us to respond in the way we have. The third I've already mentioned, because it was my opening remark. We've seen a dramatic return of the state in terms of spending, to cushion the blow, in terms of funding the vaccine developments, in terms of closing borders, in terms of closing down cities and forcing people to stay at home for long, long periods, closing down schools. I mean, this is outside total war, I think the most extraordinary demonstration of state power among the most extraordinary in history, and pretty well everywhere. I mean, it's happened not just in developed countries, but dramatically so in large developing countries, emerging countries, obviously China, also India, where there was a massive lockdown. I think it was a mistake, but they did it. And of course, in many, many, many other countries. We saw, and this is very important part of the story, a surge in, I call it health nationalism, but more broadly, every country looked after itself. The priority has been to look after its own citizens, or in Australia, residents rather than citizens, determination to keep vaccines for yourself, to control borders with different degrees of effectiveness, a lot of it perhaps symbolic, but this has not been a globally coordinated response in any significant degree. It's been national responses with limited cooperation, with the exception of inside the EU, where by and large, actually, the EU's framework of cooperation has held up pretty well in handling this, sometimes controversially, sometimes effectively. And as I said, I think we can say that global cooperation has been limited. And in fact, it's pretty clear that COVID has accelerated the breakdown in relations between the US and China. And I don't need to say that to Australia, since you know all about that. There have been huge rises in unemployment, either open unemployment or people on furlough, from those people who couldn't work from home, and that I'll come to in a moment. And of course, abrupt cessation of travel indicated, and quite important fact, the devastation of tourism as an industry, which is very important to a lot of emerging countries. And then there have, I think, been some foolish lockdowns. Not all of them have been foolish, but some of them could not possibly work. The contexts in which they were operating weren't really ones in which lockdowns could help a great deal. And in the end, the countries that did it got devastating waves of the disease anyway. I just thought I'd indicate some of these points with some charts. This shows the year-on-year change in people who use Zoom US. And this is just for last year, it then calmed down. So you can see that there was a very modest annual growth in the use of Zoom. And then in March, April of last year, suddenly we were getting 2000% rises in the use of Zoom as instantaneously the world moved into this platform. Zoom was the most used. Of course, there are a number of other platforms, you know all about that. But essentially, everybody who could go online, was able to work online, did. And this is pretty worldwide. Of course, they're by and large the professional elite. People, no doubt, like the people who are listening to this webinar. Another dramatic indication, I just don't think it's just such a striking indication, is what happened to commercial flights. These are in the hundreds of thousands. And you can see in 2020, again, in the second quarter, well, it basically fell off a cliff. Flying fell by 80%, pretty close to 80%. Essentially overnight, it started recovering again after that disastrous second quarter. It's recovering in 2021, but it's still actually pretty far below 2019. We're getting a lot of economic recovery, but international movement is still considerably below what it was before, but it is, of course, recovering. Now, let me talk about how COVID divided the world. It divided the world among businesses, a dramatic division between those which were structured to work online with remote work against those that really required face-to-face contact. And one of the most dramatic indications of this pretty well everywhere is the success of Amazon and similar retailers. So it's the dominant one, and the failure of traditional retail. That's just one aspect of this. It's been very, very bad for businesses in center office, with center town offices, all the people who serve them, and pretty well anything that requires intense face-to-face contact, particularly face-to-face contact with customers who are free not to come, who were free not to come. That also divided the world among locations, with basically city centers being hollowed out vis-a-vis the suburban places where people were living and therefore where they were working. So where I live and work now and have lived and worked for nearly 20 months, we're opening a new restaurant every day, it seems, while all the ones in London are collapsing. There has been a profound division between the more educated and the better off, who are generally able to work from home to take advantage of these new technologies. Most of the people who work in, or many of the people who work in face-to-face activities are less skilled, less educated, and less prosperous. So it's been created more inequality in that way. There is, of course, a dramatic exception to this, which are, of course, health professionals who have been working face-to-face, where particularly if they're in hospitals, and have, of course, borne great risks as a result. But I don't know how it works in Australia. None of us has been able to see a general practitioner since the start of, in the UK, since the start of COVID. Obviously, there's a big division among workers. It's already implied in what I've said, with those in face-to-face activities worse affected economically and in terms of health risks. Between genders, it's pretty clear as far as I can see that women have borne the brunt of looking after children, as has historically been the case, while many of them are also working. And there's been a big increase, as far as I can see from the statistics, in domestic violence in the lockdown situation. Among age groups, interesting contrast, the old are more vulnerable to the disease and the young more vulnerable to job loss and unemployment. So you could say that the young have borne much of the cost of our response to COVID in order to protect the old. Among wealth groups, with immense gains to rich asset owners as a result of one of the biggest stock market booms in history. Among countries, which I've already hinted at and touched on, with richer ones better able to cushion the economic shock and drive their national vaccine responses fast. And among countries also more broadly by economic impact, fiscal impact, death rates, and vaccination rates. And there, it's not just developing, it's more complicated, and I'll just sort of touch on that. And actually, I will touch upon it here. I mean, countries chose very different national strategies. That was partly influenced by what's feasible, their levels of development and so forth, but partly clearly deep policy choices. Essentially, three strategies were chosen. The first, which was clearly the case, Australia, New Zealand, essentially South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, China, was to suppress the disease outright, which meant closing everything off. The second strategy was to contain it, essentially what the Europeans and Americans decided to do in a very messy way. And then there are countries which have basically let it rip, and probably the larger country that meets that category most completely is Brazil, though actually Russia has essentially done the same thing. And of course, these divergences of strategy have necessarily led to long, very long periods of closure of borders. So let me just look at a bit of this in my charts. This is a bit complicated, but essentially what it shows, it compares to what happened in the Great Recession with COVID-19 up to September 2020. It's for the US. And what it essentially shows is that by ethnicity and sex, gender, the impact was completely different from the Great Recession, with ethnic minorities vastly more hard hit, and women significantly more hard hit this time than, so if we compare, say, white men with white women, you can see that the contrast is this time it's been a much bigger impact than before. Age, the big job losses, of course, were in the young, as I've already mentioned, and again, a dramatically divergent hit on people who'd been, I think this is the most striking chart, who hadn't finished high school or had only finished high school compared to people had graduate degrees. So the contrast in job losses there was quite dramatic. I've already mentioned economic impacts. One of the most striking divergences, and this is for the G20, this is from the latest OECD report, is the hit to unemployment. How much unemployment has fallen between the fourth quarter 2019 and the second quarter 2021. And you can see there are a number of countries where employment has actually risen. Australia seems to be the leader in this. But if you look at South Africa or Brazil or the US, the employment hit has been really, really dramatic. And again, as I said, immensely divergent, and not on a simple north-south differential here. Now, let me finally come to my last section, how might we recover from this highly divergent, complicated, and novel shock? Well, the first point is the rebound has been stronger than expected a year ago. I'm going to show that in a minute, and that's rather good news. I think it's largely due to the success of vaccination programs that have allowed a large number of countries to risk opening up to a very significant degree in the high income countries, which dominate aggregate statistics. And of course, the same was true right from the beginning with China. So the biggest economies in the world have been returning quite quickly towards a more normal way of life, at least internally. And travel is also liberalizing. But we haven't got full normalization yet. We have continuing travel restrictions, particularly between high-income countries and many developing countries. The confidence of consumers is still quite weak. As the Delta variant goes through the US, for example, it's clear that people are losing confidence to some degree in going out and shopping and going to restaurants. And of course, as I will show you, immensely divergent vaccination success. And I think it's also true for the many reasons I've discussed, technological and geopolitical. I've touched on the US-China breakdown. The new normal is just not going to be the same as the old one in complicated ways, which we can't fully yet work out, but we're not going to go back to the world as it was in 2019 and as we thought it would continue to be after the world. The probability, I think, is that the world will remain more divided and more fearful for quite a while. And of course, that will come to this moment be more true if we get more variants, which are even more fatal and possibly even vaccine resistant. And we'll have to go through the cycle of vaccine development again. So this is again from the very latest OECD report just out a few days ago, and I think it's quite illuminating. So these are aggregates for G20 countries. These are advanced economies on the left and emerging countries on the right. They show, the blue line shows what they thought GDP would be if on the basis of the pre-pandemic expectations. Obviously, crucially, they of course expect emerging economies to grow much faster than developed countries, as they've been doing for decades since the early 90s. And of course, the great shift of economic weight from the developed high-income countries to the rest of the world, above all Asian countries, will continue. In the December 2020 projection, they expected a permanent deep hit after this massive decline in 2020, recovery, but weak growth thereafter. Now they're more optimistic that we will recover back to the pre-crisis trends in the case of the high-income countries by the end of 2022. That's sort of the expectation. Obviously, the light blue area is the forecast. So there will have been a big loss. We won't reverse those losses over this period, and it's not clear we will. Their estimates is the growth will slow, so there will be permanent losses in the past, but we'll get back in the developed countries to trend. However, in the case of emerging and developing countries, though the growth will be faster than developed countries, they do not expect a return to trend. In other words, this is a permanent scarring in terms of levels of GDP at the very least for emerging and developing countries. And that has, of course, been associated with an enormous increase in the number of people in absolute poverty, in extreme poverty. The World Bank estimates that at about 100 million people, the first large increase in absolute poverty for a very long time. And the suggestion is that this will not be reversed. I'm not going to go into this detail. This gives the forecasts in more detail. You can see the dramatic declines in GDP in 2020, which I talked about, simply staggering. But there is pretty universal expectation of recovery in 2021, but with some remarkably weak cases like Russia. And many emerging developing countries will not reverse the losses of 2020 this year, and in levels, not just in growth in and they will have experienced as a result permanent losses in GDP. This just gives you an idea of what I think is the most striking divergence now, which is vaccination rates. So this is the proportion of population that has received one jab up to now. The blue are so-called advanced economies, the brown are emerging economies, and the light brown, the orange, and the dark brown are low-income countries. And well, basically, there's a dramatic divergence in vaccination rates, and most of the low-income world has really not been vaccinated at all. Populations are younger. Nonetheless, this is a very significant handicap for them in terms of opening up their economies, and it's likely to remain as a very significant impact. We can vaccinate most of the world within about 6 months, 8 months from now. This is from an IMF analysis, which I used to show this. It looks as though they could have a program to vaccinate most of the world by April 2022. Just yesterday, the US has promised 500 million doses, which will help. But as things are at the moment, as I understand it, it's unlikely that what they show for April 2022 for poorer countries in particular will not materialize, and the vaccination divergence will continue well into next year, possibly even after that. There is the potential for donation of billions of surplus doses. There is a potential for increasing production of vaccines. It's not clear how much of this is going to actually happen, and up to now, it hasn't happened in very large measure. There are some further risks for the future. Economic disruption as inflation surges and monetary policies tightened in a world of what has become extraordinarily high debt. There are China's debt problems and those of other emerging developing countries, and that may well deepen these difficulties, particularly if monetary policies tightened in the US. That won't be so important for China, but it will be for other emerging and developing countries. Trade wars are likely as China and the US seek to decouple. And there are, of course, the risk of new variants of the coronavirus that are more infectious, fatal, vaccine resistant, and of course, new viruses. We have been know that the virus world has tried to give us a pandemic quite often, and this time it succeeded. Maybe it will again. And there are, of course, always other sources of global disruption. I think it's pretty easy to see that we live in a pretty fragile world. This just indicates the inflation risk. I'm really getting very close to the end. The blue columns here were the forecasts by consensus forecast, the average of all forecasters of inflation for this year back in January of this year. And the red columns show the current forecast. And as you can see, the conventional forecasters got it pretty completely wrong, and we're living in a much higher inflation world than people expected. And the big question is this temporary or permanent? If it's temporary, the central banks can ignore it. If it turns out to be quite long lasting and work through into wages, it's going to be more difficult for them to ignore it, and that could add a further disruption to our recovery phase. And finally, I'll just show for emerging economies where debt is concentrated. There are quite a number of countries with really quite high debt ratios. If we move to a higher interest rate world, most of these countries have record high levels of debt. I'm not going to go into developed countries. You can easily imagine defaults, quite a number of defaults. Indeed, Argentina is already in default. China won't, of course, have any international defaults, but it has significant debt problems domestically, and that could constrain our growth after a long period of leveraging up our economies. So my conclusion is, unfortunately, we don't yet know how the world economy will emerge from the COVID shock because it's so novel and so complicated. The crisis has been briefer than was expected in 2020, largely because of the successful vaccination programs, but the success was in the context of huge diversions and frictions within and across countries, which are unlikely to disappear soon and make it very difficult for us to emerge together from this shock. And there are substantial risks ahead. And if we're going to handle these challenges, we need to come together strongly to tackle the challenges related to the economy, to vaccination, and of course, other global challenges, notably climate. And at the moment, I'm afraid the biggest lesson I've learned from this crisis is that we really find it very difficult to cooperate. The answers we found have been national. Some of them have worked, some of them have less so. But I think we have to accept that we are currently emerging from this shock in a more disintegrated state than we were when we went into it. And that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Martin. Lots of food for thought there. At this stage, I'd like to invite Renus on the virtual stage, and I'm going to kick off the discussion with asking Andrew to comment on what can we learn from. We've faced now, as Martin points out, really a double whammy of back-to-back crises, you know, in one sense. What can we learn from the history of crises and the impact on inequality?
Simon, I think it's a great question. And can I, as you did, just acknowledge the traditional owners on whose lands I'm coming to you from today. Dara Nuna, Dara Nunawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Nanawalwari, Dara Wari, Dindi, Wangarlinjinyan. I think the lesson of crises is possibly best summed up by that work of Walter Scheidel, who finds that inequality only falls under conditions of crisis, be that war or plague. And this is, in some sense, a moment that can be a bit like the end of World War II, when the world became, for a couple of decades, much more equal than it had been beforehand, in which policymakers didn't simply say, let's get things back the way they were in 1939, but actually took a much more ambitious approach and really managed to put in place policies that boosted home ownership, increased union membership rates, and saw wages go up a lot. But in Australia, that requires recognising that we had an inequality problem that predated COVID. Real wages had been stagnant for the better part of a decade, house prices going through the roof and pricing young people out of the market, measures of wealth income inequality increasing substantially. So the challenge really is to take the scope of political possibility that COVID has opened up and use that now to much better invest in education, to change the character of work. I think no longer can we have a situation in which casual workers have to choose between missing a paycheck or going to work sick, and in which we actually ensure that we expand home ownership substantially. I'm also really concerned, Simon, about the impact that the pandemic has had on globalisation. And I thought Martin's presentation drew this out brilliantly. You know, if you were a populist anti-globaliser, in some sense, you couldn't have brought around a better shock than COVID because it's shut down immigration by necessity, generated fear of foreigners, and risks setting back the gains from globalisation considerably. And the worst impact of that, of course, is for a modestly sized country like Australia, with well less than 1% of the world's population. Now, America can afford to shut off from the rest of the world. We can't. And the risk to companies of not being able to access global immigrant skills the risk to wages of not having access to global capital, and the risk of to exporters of not having access to trade is really something that concerns me a great deal. I can understand why the government's done this Anglosphere agreement with the American and British governments around the procurement of nuclear submarines, but I didn't understand why they needed off the back of that to snub China's attempt to enter the CPTPP. If our biggest trading partner wants to be part of a trade liberalisation deal, I think we ought to be setting the pathway ahead rather than blocking the road. So there's just a few thoughts on Martin's excellent presentation there.
Thanks, Andrew. So you raised a couple of interesting topics that I think Sarah might have some thoughts on, perhaps, in particular, the issue of what do we think the distributional impacts are going to be, and also the issue of, that Martin raised, and I think Andrew touched on, with the retreat of globalization. What's the differential impact on advanced versus developing and emerging markets? Any thoughts, Sarah?
Yes, many thoughts, and thank you, Martin, for your presentation. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and discussing these very interesting topics with you. I have a few thoughts, but three main thoughts, I suppose, that I'm trying to organise and collect together. The first thought, and where I've been thinking a lot, is around, if I'm just looking within economies and perhaps particularly focusing on advanced economies, so Australia being an example of that. Martin articulated very, very clearly and nicely, it's the lower income professions have generally been hardest hit. So, and as Andrew mentioned as well, those casual workers in retail, hospitality, the arts and entertainment, they also tend to be on the lowest wages, younger people, and predominantly women as well, disproportionately women. So those, we can see they're the group that have been the most impacted, and the sectors that have been most impacted. I think it is worth also pointing out, though, and thinking, when you look at that OECD chart on their forecast for advanced economy GDP, and our forecast, my forecasts are not too dissimilar, really. We get back to that level of GDP and we sort of trundle along, but there is that permanent loss in total income, if you like, over the lifetime, the working lifetime of an individual in these areas, over a business that operates in that sector. And there's no real chance for them to make that back up. I think the corollary to this, if you like, for possibly quite a few people on the line, is we've been in lockdown, stuck at home, likely have accumulated a lot of excess savings. I know I've myself have clearly not been spending money on holidays. I think that's a common theme. I've accumulated, my household has accumulated substantial excess savings. So my wealth position, actually my financial position, has improved through the pandemic. But that's a very stark contrast to that first group that I mentioned. And I think that wealth stock position is as important to think about as the income flows. The income flows will recover. They already are in many cases, although not quite for us here, given we're still in lockdown. The stock, though, they may never be able to make that loss back. And finally, just a quick point on that as well. That move, of course, has been reinforced by the movement in asset prices through this. So if you were the ultimate winner in this, you were accumulating excess savings last year, you funneled a lot of it into equities, and you bought a house maybe, particularly in Australia, you really have won, relatively speaking, compared to that first group. The second area I've been thinking again a lot about is thinking about cross countries, and Martin picked up on this, and this idea around globalization is definitely one facet of this, but just again thinking longer term at the countries that have been the losers and why that's the case. I agree as well with the OECD, generally speaking, the emerging markets, I think there is a permanent loss to their trajectory for GDP. So not only have they had that loss of income last year and this year, but they never get back to that pre-pandemic trajectory for income. So there's a permanent loss that carries on for them. Why is that the case, and how might we tackle that? Well, I think there's a few things there. One is thinking about what is it that's been lost from their productive potential that's not been lost from advanced economies. I think what we're seeing there is that in emerging markets, you generally got conditions of poorer connectivity, poorer infrastructure, which just didn't enable working from home. And indeed, because they didn't have those things in place in the first place, their economies were built much more on interactions, informal economies where people need to meet people to do business, to get on. You shut that off the way those countries did, and they did impose lockdowns. Those skills, those businesses, they become lost. And there's some really very challenging examples. India is the one we often think about, but across Asia Pacific alone, the Philippines, Indonesia, particularly these countries are really have seen substantial losses to their permanent income. And then finally, on top of that, the other big loss, again, Martin mentioned it, and it's not to be sniffed at, education, and thinking of that as human capital, an investment in your workforce tomorrow. All children have suffered through the pandemic. I have one at home myself at the moment, but at least I'm in a position to enable learning from home for her. I can give her access to the internet, and she can have materials and what have you. I'm not a substitute for her teacher, but I'm something. In many, many countries, that's just not possible. Those children have lost those years of school. They will never get them back. So I think that there's something there for the global economy really to think about and challenge itself to try and reverse some of this damage. And then I think the final point I'd like to pick up on is, again, just thinking about the growth trajectory and some of what Martin was saying about those elevated debt levels and how do we manage those. I think what's interesting here, for me, there is a real balance here on, yes, we have to be concerned about managing that debt position. Governments cannot continue to spend as they are right now forevermore. That is very true. But if I'm thinking about those spending patterns, people like me, us at home with our excess savings, and how are we going to return our consumption patterns to normal? It's not going to be overnight. I'm looking at next year and very much hoping I'm going to get away for a holiday. But am I going to spend as much next year as I did in 2019 on holidays? I'm not sure. I'm a bit cautious about booking anything. I don't think I'm alone in this. I think this is generally a pattern we've seen across advanced economies. People are still spending disproportionately large amounts on goods, on doing their homes up, renovations, new build activity, that sort of thing. They're not spending in these other areas. And overall, their spending patterns are taking time to transition back. That transition for excess saving is taking time to unwind. If governments pull out too quickly, then you've not got that private sector demand, you've got the government pulling back. That could potentially be a not great outcome for the world economy and for individual countries. So that's something else I'm very much monitoring. But I agree with Martin, it's an absolute tightrope.
Thanks, Sarah. So Martin, I'm going to jump on one of your early slides, the pickup of Zoom, which is really quite striking. And I think both Andrew and Sarah touched on this. Is really, if we think of this as a permanent change in the economy, do you think that the nature of work and the nature of employment is going to change permanently as we move forward? And knock-on effects on inequality there, or is it transitory?
First of all, these are wonderful comments and remind me that really I needed an hour-and-a-half lecture. Topic. I thought about having a section on long-term scarring, but I just thought I'd have too much time. So basically, I agree with all the comments. I do have a reaction to Andrew on one point. I have a terrible fear that this is going to be in an anti-1945. But I just sort of build on what I said and what Sarah said. In really every dimension I can see, this has been a disequalizing shock. And that's sort of unequalizing. I don't know what the right word is. Disequalizing is probably best. It's made things more unequal in undesirable directions. It's hurt the young against the old, and really that's ridiculous. It's hurt the less skilled. It's hurt the poorest countries. It's hurt the poorest people in the world. And it has immensely benefited wealthy professionals and the really rich, who have gone on and very happily. And reversing that impact requires a political revolution. And I'm afraid it's not what I'm seeing. I'm writing a book about it. We can discuss why that's so, but I don't think that's what we're seeing. Rather, we're seeing a doubling down on right-wing populism. Now, I'm not saying that everywhere, but it's true in very important places, like Britain. And not to mention America. So I think your hope for the future will depend on political genius. Good luck. I hope you're right. The second question, I agree with everything Sarah said. I have no comment. It's all wise and right. Particularly on the point I didn't emphasize, the education shock. I can see this with my grandchildren. Very similar situation. Live next door, actually. You know, they're going to be fine. Completely unaffected. 6 and 4, their education is completely unaffected, but that's certainly not true of many people, even in Britain. I don't know about Australia. We have a lot of people in Britain who don't have first-rate broadband connections, and they don't have their own computers, and they don't have their own room to work in, and they don't have parents who can help them for a whole host of reasons, often because they're working. So it's dramatic how much worse, I believe, educational outcomes will turn out to be. Now, maybe if they're 6, they can make up for it, but if they're 16, much more difficult. And finally, on the Zoom impact, more broadly, have we seen a fundamental shift in the pattern of work? My guess, and it really is a guess, is yes. We have realized we could do things. We've been forced to realize, that was the point why I stressed it so much, incredibly quickly, because there was no alternative if our businesses were to operate at all, that we could do things in a different way. And a very large number of people like me have found that they rather enjoy it. The truth is, my employer now said, you know, you must come back to the office 5 days a week. I think I'd finally retire. So I would just be too unpleasant and go freelance. I mean, now my position is obviously a little exceptional, but I think for many people, the flexibility this has given them is crucial. And I believe that's going to be particularly true for parents with young children. I may be wrong on that, but that's my guess. They really will want to keep the flexibility this has given them because it's so attractive. And I don't think employers can reverse that. And lots of employers will think, well, if we can halve the number of office spaces or maybe reduce them by 2/3, that saves us an awful lot of money. Basically, most of our office spaces becomes people's homes. That's fine. It's a big saving in cost. As well as on commuting and all the rest of it. So I suspect this is a semi-permanent shock. We have jumped into a new world, which is again a reinforcement of inequality, because some people can do it and others can't. And there are lots of people who lose out terribly because nobody's traveling anymore and so forth. I have one final comment on this, is something I couldn't mention, which is about the nature of globalization. I've been arguing about this for quite a while. I think the globalization of goods is just not going to be, even if it's not going to grow the way it used to. We've done that. We've integrated our real economies more than ever before. And from here on, I think it's generally downwards. But the integration, the movement of people, I suspect, is going to be permanently down. Lots of people have found they don't need to be in an airplane all the time. And I think they will decide they don't need to be in an airplane all the time. But virtual globalization, the integration of people in this way, running businesses, transacting, in sharing ideas, doing seminars, all that is going to explode. So this is the dimension of globalization, which I think will be permanently changed. And that will also have quite considerable employment implications. So I'll give you one example. I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but my son runs an IT company. And he's now, for the first time, hired IT engineers whom he's never met, who are all over the world, and he probably never will meet, and they all operate a virtual firm. Now, you should have said, well, that's logical. Why didn't they do this all along? But they didn't. Apple and Google and all these other companies used to have tens of thousands of people in headquarters. These are the IT companies. Why? I suspect this is a permanent shift. And again, all of this benefits the professional and elite of our societies, and not everybody else. It will again be another very powerful disequalizing force, which comes, and this is my last comment, which comes, and I didn't mention this, on what Andrew said, a very long period in which the general tendency within countries has been in that direction.
Thanks, Martin. I'm just going to quickly make a comment myself about the nature of the technology change. I joined Microsoft in 2014. Of course, you know, we're not using Microsoft Teams, but Microsoft does, even back in 2014. So the first question they ask you when you join Microsoft is, do you need an office? So even back in 2014, the tech companies were already moving away from physical locations to, and what I've seen has blown me away. It's 5 years. It's 5 years transformation in a couple of weeks. And so it really is. I agree. I think it's permanent. I think it's profound. So with the discussion of inequality, I think I'm going to hand it back to Andrew to see if he's got some comments there to respond to.
Thanks, Simon. And just a couple of observations. Martin's certainly right that the risk when you invite a professor turned politician on your show is that I start talking about how the world is and then move on to how the world ought to be. But let me try and put my professorial hat back on and think about how this has affected politics. Martin, I do think you flagged up one shift, which is the whole Margaret Thatcher, there's no such thing as society view is gone. The whole Ronald Reagan government is the problem, not the solution, is out the window. So, you know, we've now got Boris Johnson raising the corporate tax rate and increasing overall expenditure. And I suspect that kind of big government conservative model is locked in. So in some sense, the Ayn Rand folks have been pushed out of the political mainstream. I also think it's striking to see how Joe Biden has managed to move health to be a much more critical issue in the public policy debate and has been able to push through bigger spending packages than perhaps would have been possible beforehand, with climate at the heart of it. And the climate debate does highlight one of the factors about COVID, which is that it's increased our focus on existential risk, and hopefully also increased our sense that populists are particularly dangerous when they exacerbate existential risk. I've been working on a book which looks at how this applies across pandemics, climate change, nuclear warfare and the like. And I think in all of those cases, there really is a danger to the world posed by populists, and it's one of the reasons why populism is bad for your health. Final observation, COVID, I believe, has shifted attitudes to the world of work and to work safety, which is something you can either think of as an industrial issue, but is also in some sense a health issue. And that's probably going to be an important way in which unions look to rebuild through this. And it's going to be important as people move towards having a better work-life balance. The idea that we're on call from work at all times, that we're spending inordinate amounts of time in the office, and flexibility means being there when the boss's automatic scheduling software says we should be, is hopefully going to give way to a world in which families are better able to combine work and parenting. Now, I'm doing this with 3 kids in the house, and we'll be diving into preparing them a late dinner afterwards. So greater flexibility is hopefully going to be good in terms of gender equity in the workplace, as well as just allowing people to live better lives.
All right, so we've got a bit of an upbeat note there. Thanks, Andrew. So we've got 28 questions in the chat panel. I've sort of Assad's helped me distill them down to a couple, to taking the intersection of them. But I'm going to distill it down even more. So one class of questions was around Martin, this is not the first pandemic. You know, the world reacted to the financial crisis with some degree of financial, coordination with Basel and whatnot. Why do you think, everybody knew as you said, everybody knew a pandemic would be coming at some point in time. why weren't we better prepared?
Yeah, I think human beings seem to be remarkably bad at preparing for things that they know are going to happen at some point, but they have no idea when.
Yep.
It's what I think of as the low probability, high impact problem. I think it's one of the characteristic problems of investors. You know, think about what your investment position should be for next year. I mean, it's pretty obvious. The probability is it'll be much like this year. I mean, that's what years usually are. But there is a non-zero probability that it will be totally different. But you don't know in what direction, and you don't know whether it'll be super good or more probably super bad, because as I joke, the world generally only crashes downwards. So that's what crashes are. So what do you do with that? And the problem applies not just to investors, it applies to governments. How much money do you devote, resources, thinking, intellectual bandwidth to a problem that is low probability in any given year and indeed in your time horizon, but if it happened, were dramatic? And what is striking, so let's take the UK case, which obviously I know well. We had done very sophisticated war gaming of financial crises in the Bank of England and the Treasury in 2006, I think. And the British professional bureaucracy isn't particularly insane. There were lots of people aware of the risks of a pandemic. But none of this sort of intellectual awareness of such risks had worked through to the whole range of actors that immediately get involved when you have a first-class crisis of this kind, for whom this was a very remote concern. It's not just about having some health professionals and maybe one or two economists in the Treasury or the Bank of England who've thought a bit about what a pandemic might mean. You need an enormous number of people to act together effectively, transform the way they're operating in our health system. I could give many, many examples. What do you do about testing? Well, we had to throw away the whole testing structure, but no one had thought that through. So having resilience and responsiveness in the whole of a system, governmental systems and private systems, being able to interact and with people making the decisions who are mainly political leaders who have no clue about this, it's just unbelievably hard. And as said, and I agree completely, we've had many pandemics. Now, I did a column on, this is the last time I did a column on pandemics once, and I went back through what we know about past pandemics over the last 2,000 years. Now, of course, we don't know that much, but we do know there have been pandemics which killed staggering proportions of the population. Black Death, the Antonine Plague, Justinian Plague. The truth is, they were just things that happened and nobody thought you could manage them. You died. And they did use quarantine. Quarantine was very effective. And in the Spanish flu, they did respond with quarantine, and there were effective actions, but nobody thought we could do what we did this time. The big difference is our response capability. And the response capability involved very, very dramatic actions, which mitigated the impact of the pandemic significantly, but of course had all the social and economic consequences we've been discussing. I hope we learn from this, and I'm sure that the next pandemic will be responded to much more effectively if it happens in the next 10 years, 40, 50 years from now, who knows?
Yeah, I agree. Some of the questions, there's several questions on the impact on inequality, which I think we've covered, both generational and international and gendered. But one series of questions is around the cost benefit analysis of shutdowns. So Martin, you sort of alluded to you thought some of the shutdowns were inappropriate in some countries. I think there's a little bit of an appetite. Can you name and shame? Given that we're in lockdown number 6 in Melbourne, any sort of, it seems like there hasn't been enough, or at least in Australia, honest discussion of the cost benefit of lockdowns. Any thought on where that dialogue's been more effectively held?
This is quite a complicated issue, and this was a throwaway line. This is what I very, very quickly, for reasons that I think Sarah mentioned, doing lockdowns in developing countries is a very high cost, high impact thing to do. And this is because the proportion of the population that can work from home effectively is significantly smaller. The majority of the population has to work face to face, and a lot of them are living on a hand-to-mouth basis on daily income from informal sector activity or as servants, things which are intensely face to face. And if you lock everything down, and even worse, as happened in India, basically force everybody to go home, I believe the negative social impact, which is a colossal, vastly exceeds the health benefits. The other factor in that, though I don't want to exaggerate this, but none is true, particularly in Africa, the populations are vastly younger. And for that reason, the incidence of the disease was reasonably expected to be milder. So I think in the lockdown, my colleague David Pilling has just written about the lockdowns he's just written an excellent piece on Uganda. The lockdowns in Africa and the initial lockdown in India, and I haven't looked at all that, were very difficult to defend. Certainly, unless you had a mechanism, as the Vietnamese, of course, had, essentially to use it as, they never did with lockdown, as I understand, but basically to have a mechanism for pure suppression. Then the second point I would make, in the developed countries, generally, they never worked out till vaccines came along, apart from your case, the suppression cases, the full suppression cases, what they were quite trying to do with lockdown. And that was dramatically true in continental Europe and America. So in general, lockdowns came far too late. When they were introduced, they then were released too early, and as a result, we had far too many, which didn't really make a difference. They were just an intense irritant. So I wouldn't say the idea of lockdown in all circumstances was indefensible, but I think they were handled really rather badly. Finally, the cost-benefit analysis, I was generally one of the people who argued that there were very good reasons for going the lockdown route, even though standard health economics cost-benefit analysis would argue against it. I don't think I have time now to go through why that's so, but the most important argument, which I think is crucial, is if the disease is rampant, people aren't going to go out anyway. So just pretending that you can let it rip and it will have no effect on your economy, which is what Bolsonaro has tried to do, is pretty crazy. And in our case, where we have more opportunity from working from home, it would have been completely crazy. So I'm not arguing against lockdowns from an ideological point of view, far from it. But I do think they could have been handled much better. And I hope next time we will have a much more coherent set of strategies to respond to this quicker, more effectively, and in a more targeted way.
Super. Well, we're almost out of time. I've got one that I'll just throw out for everybody just to give their brief comments on it. given Martin's point about how countries are diverging in strategy and the lack of international cooperation, what could the UN do better to try and foster cooperation? I'll start with Sarah.
That is the question. I think if they had even a remote answer to that, they would be trying that and hopefully doing better. For me, I think the recognition by all national governments all over the world that this pandemic is not that we're necessarily going to be able to eradicate COVID in any sort of reasonable time frame. I'm not sure we will, but even taking a step back from that, getting to a point where we can, COVID normal looks something like what 2019 looked like. That requires the pandemic to be tackled everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's so infectious that, even if the idea of reopening the borders and having sort of home quarantine and travel bubbles and things, that will in all likelihood not be anything like enough control of the disease to prevent seeding events here in New Zealand and in any other country globally. So if we're serious about trying to suppress the disease and actually live with it so that day-to-day life, most people feel that they can go out and about and live what they want as a normal life, we have to tackle the disease globally. We have to vaccinate globally. So I would strongly hope that there is a push on that develops economies perhaps think about who in their population needs to be vaccinated, about who should or shouldn't get access to booster shots, and about frankly putting some money and just donating the money, if not the actual doses themselves, into vaccinating the world. The cost of doing that is peanuts compared to the cost of continuing to try and tackle and limit spread of the disease. It's an absolute no-brainer. To a cost-benefit analysis point, it's got to be the best one on record. I think even Martin, you might have said that in an article that you wrote. I couldn't agree more. I read it at the time. Thought absolutely. So that is, I'm not sure how they can do that, what they can do differently to do that. But that is, for me, the number one thing that any global organisation should be doing right now.
All right, Andrew.
Look, Sarah's absolutely nailed the case for vaccinating the world. So let me take a different tack, which is to focus on climate change. I think there's a terrific role for the United Nations to play in encouraging countries to make the necessary renewables investments to reduce emissions. It's a valuable fiscal stimulus at a time in which effective unemployment rates are really high. Let's remember that Australia's effective unemployment rate, if you take into account 0 hours people and people who've dropped out of the labour market, is now somewhere around 11 to 14%. So we're going to need the renewables jobs, and of course that helps decarbonise the economy more rapidly. But it's a great role for the United Nations too, because it's a terrific chance to remind people around the world that this is a classic problem of global public goods. When it comes to climate change, we're all in it together. The carbon that's emitted on one side of the world causes the natural disasters on another side of the world. So in addition to Sarah's critical point about getting those vaccines out for the COVAX initiative, we need to start accelerating action on climate in order to reap the employment and the emissions reductions benefits. That's the end from me. Thanks so much to you, Simon, and CDES for putting on a really stimulating conversation.
Well, thanks, Andrew. We'll give the final word to Martin. Anything to add, Martin?
Well, I agree very strongly with what Sarah and Andrew have said. My job is, I think, to rain on people's parades. Let's define the challenge, because I'm writing a whole book about this. Our politics, our response has been, as I try to stress, divergent, and in general, it has not improved international cooperation. We've gone on our own. Mm-hmm. And when the state comes back, particularly when the state comes back at a time of fear, like this one, and anger, then the tendency is for everybody to go and look inwards. And the results are dramatically irrational policy, which Sarah brought out. I mean, the decisions on the global vaccine program are simply insane. I mean, the stupidest decisions I think I've ever been taken by anybody in my lifetime in terms of cost benefit analysis, as mentioned. So we are actually pulled away from the ideal global response by the national impact of a global event. And the only way we can get out of that is really by a very profound awareness among political leaders that this is ruinous. And I've been shocked by how unwilling people have been to say that and to do that in my prime minister, the presidents of the US, and of course now the conflicts with China. So the logic is absolutely clear. We have to combine strong states with a strong global response. It seems to be something humanity is very, very bad at doing because fear makes us tribal, intensely tribal. And that's what's happened. And of course, Andrew's point about right-wing populism is part of that. At least we know what the enemy is, as it were, and we obviously have to fight against it. But we should recognize this is really our war now. If we don't preserve a sense of global cohesion of some kind, we're going to go to hell. But I think at the moment, I don't think remarkably few political leaders or political forces truly internalize that reality.
Well, thanks, Martin. Hopefully we've got one of those political leaders on the stage with us. But I'd just like to thank all of our panelists, Martin, Sarah, Andrew. This was a phenomenal event. I'd like to thank Sisera, Asad, Shahab, everybody putting the team who put it all together. And I'd like to thank our audience and remind them, if you'd like to come to more of these seminars, please sign up. In the chat is the address where you can be on our mailing list. And thank you all. Cheers.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Simon. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.